I request the chairperson to kindly introduce Madam.
Good morning, everybody. After listening to the motivational speech, now we are switching over to DLN Murtirao Award. Madam, just giving a brief idea about the DLN Murtirao Award. Professor DLN Murtirao Oration Award has been instituted in the memory of the late Dr. DLN Murtirao, a senior fellow of the Indian Psychiatric Society. This oration will be delivered at each annual conference at the Indian Psychiatric Society. Mainly, it is based on services to the development of the psychiatry, contribution to the Indian psychiatry, contribution to teaching, training and research in the psychiatry, overall seniority in the psychiatry and recognition, and standing amongst fellow psychiatrists in India. And give her a big applaud. Dr. Pratima Murthy is selected by the committee for today's oration. Now, Dr. Rathi, please go through her biodata.
Pratima Murthy is such a known name in our organization that she doesn't require any introduction, but she is a current director and senior professor of psychiatry. She is alumnus of Bangalore Medical College at Nimmans, diploma in psychiatry from University of Psychiatry, Manchester, fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and Physicians, and consultant to WHO India, and many other organizations. Active role in formulating a national treatment policy regarding substances use and recipient of multiple national and international awards. As I told you, and I'm very happy to see to it that she has chosen leadership, a narrative gaze through the lens of a psychiatrist. And this is very important. The topic she has chosen is already very near to my heart, as you already spoken on that subject. With this, I invite Dr. Pratima Murthy. Please go ahead with your oration, please.
Thank you very much. A very warm good morning to all of you. I think this could not have been better following the previous presentation by the Honorable President, Dr. Rathi, who emphasized the ingredients of leadership, and therefore it just makes so much sense to kind of now talk about leadership. Before I actually start, I wanted to compliment the organizers. Dr. Rathi, already you complimented them about their time management. But what I was most impressed with is the efficiency at the registration counter. So many young people doing things so slickly. And just before this oration, I got a call from one of the organizers making sure I was in the auditorium. And I think that speaks extremely well for the wonderful organization. So congratulations to the organizers. Could I have my slides come up, please? So in some ways, what I'm going to say today in terms of leadership at the DLN Murtirao oration is build up on some of the things that Dr. Rathi talked about. And I just wanted to say that I'm also going to provide some kind of a context. So while Dr. Rathi talked about the next couple of years of leadership and what his plans are, I am going to possibly review a lifelong journey, professional journey, and try and see how we can actually develop leadership, to the next level, particularly for those of us working in psychiatry, although this would, of course, be relevant to anyone working as a doctor in the field of medicine. Before I go ahead, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. DLN Murtirao. He was, he's more than a centenarian now. He was a graduate of the Mysore Medical College, which coincidentally has a centennial year this year. He joined the Bangalore Mental Hospital where I work. So it's wonderful to be associated with a colleague whom I've never seen in 1945. At that time, as all of you know, there was no training in psychiatry in India. So doctors went abroad to do their psychiatric training. And he did his diploma in psychological medicine and also got his MRCP there. But at that time, the MRCP was in neurology and in medicine. So he had a combination of training in medicine, neurology, and psychiatry, which really became so useful Because when you see Dr. D.L.N. Murthy Rao's records, his case notes in the mental hospital, you'll see how he applied biological and social constructs so effortlessly in the case notes that he maintained. After he returned, he worked in the mental hospital from 1951, initially as the medical superintendent, and thereafter served as director, but he died very, very young in 1962. He was one of 9 children. And it's very interesting that several members of his family, both, senior to him, as well as in successive generations, have also been doctors. His son, Dr. Jaisimha Rao, is a practicing psychiatrist in Ontario and has, just like Dr. D.L.N. Murthy Rao done, dedicated his life to children with intellectual disabilities. So his whole family has worked in the area of intellectual disabilities. Now, I thought for the very senior people here, this is a great reminiscence. You'll see Dr. Govind Swami, who was the first director of the All India Institute of Mental Health, which is celebrating its 70th year this year. You will see Murthy Rao seated here. I'll just point out that there are several people who have been in positions of leadership that you will see in this photograph. There is, of course, Dr. Mani, who was a leading neurologist. You will see Dr. Sharada Menon here, who again is lauded as the first woman psychiatrist in the country. You'll see Dr. Satyavati here, who again contributed a lot to clinical psychology. Going backwards, you will see Dr. Narayan Reddy, who was a former director of NIMHANS. You will also see Dr. Chanbaswarna here. So there is, of course, the person who started off in Miraj, Dr. Somebody remind me, Dr. Deb Sikdar here. So you'll see a lot of people who not only worked in government practice, but also in the private sector, and they're all leaders in their own rights. Just one more picture again with Murthy Rao, where you will see Dr. R.M. Verma, who started the first neurosurgery department here. You'll see Dr. Venkobarao. You'll see Dr. Verghese here. So I think it's very, very important to view historically how various stalwarts have contributed to the history of psychiatry, to the growth of psychiatry. Dr. D.L.N. Murthy Rao worked with the ICMR. He worked with people like Dr. Carstairs. He was a very close friend of Vikram Sarabhai and was very, very influential in developing the All India Institute of Mental Health. But his primary interest was also in developing ECTs, and one of the models of ECT machines that he developed is there in the museum at NIMHANS. And he was a prolific writer. He was a great teacher. And he was very, very well known for his modesty. So, in fact, because of his modesty, he probably did not really exhibit the charisma of many of the leaders of his generation. But only his students will recall what an astute clinician and teacher he was. So, in the course of my presentation, I'm going to talk to you on a variety of areas. But I'm going to intermix it, so it's not necessarily in any specific order. I'm going to perhaps talk about what leadership is and dilate on some of the issues that Dr. Rathi mentioned. Talked about different styles of relationships. Talk to each of us about how can many of us cultivate leadership skills. And that's particularly for the young people in the audience. How can teachers be leaders? And of course, one very, very important question to all of us. Is it the position of being a leader, or is it necessary for us to cultivate leadership qualities? And I think that's one important area that I'm just going to discuss a little bit. What about leadership in medicine and psychiatry in particular? And finally, in the entire course of my presentation, I'm going to talk about the leadership that we have seen in our lifetimes, and you might be able to identify such leadership qualities in the people that you have worked under. Leadership that we have all been called on to demonstrate, and what is the legacy of leadership we can leave for future generations. I'm just going to be able to, hope I'm going to be able to cover all these areas. Now, what is the concept of leadership? The main areas in leadership is really to be able to inspire others, to be able to have an influence on others, And remember, to be a leader, you must have people who will follow you. And therefore, the context of a group becomes very important when you're discussing leadership. It's also about dealing with change. And we just saw a change in leadership at the helm of the Indian Psychiatric Society to set new direction, which Dr. Rathi spoke about, and to align people to kind of redirect themselves in that new direction and be motivated to work for a larger purpose. I don't know how many of you have seen this ad. I'm not going to play this ad, but I'm going to tell you a small story about this particular ad. It's available on YouTube. And it talks about 3 young people who were asked to say who was the most important of these 4 people and who was the least important. So there was a young woman who said she thought that justice was most important because the judge delivers judgments, makes sure there's no crime in the country, regulates all the laws of the country. A young man said it's the doctor who's very important because the doctor looked after all of us, particularly during COVID when everybody ran away. It was the doctor who dedicated his life, risked his life, and looked after us. Another young man said, no, it's the captain. He works in the army. He guards our borders. He gives up his life for the sake of the country. They were asked, who was the least important person? All the 3 of them were unanimous in their decision or in their impression, and they thought the lady sitting second here, who has no title to her name, was the least important. They asked them why, and they said, hasn't achieved anything. And then they asked the lady to respond. She smiled and she said, I am the teacher to all of these 3 people. So I think that's a very positive story on how important teachers are in our lives. So I thought I'll just go back in my own journey and talk about when I was young. There was a time in the later 1960s when the person who inspired me most was this 18-year-old who was my class teacher. She had all the qualities of leadership that Dr. Rathi spoke about. The ability to inspire, to motivate all of us. We do anything, she said, without any questions. We do it with a smile. We take her little gifts every day to school, when we went to school. And we'd be so happy if she had a good word for us. She was a leader. Excellent time management, excellent organizational skills. This is one person who possibly was such an effective leader, and sometimes we really don't talk about that. I sent this photograph to my classmates and said, may I use it? And you won't believe the kind of excitement it created. First of all, they didn't know who was who. They had to recognize themselves in this photograph and then talk about various other anecdotes, about the time this happened. There was a flurry of other photographs that people had. So it set off a big memory kind of cruise for everybody who kind of was on that particular group. And then, of course, there were these 2 leaders. All she had to do, she was the principal of the school. She didn't have to say a word. If she wasn't happy with you, she would just stand there silent, not saying a word. And she was such an effective leader in terms of the silence that she used that it was amazing the kind of discipline and rigor that was there in the entire school. And then there was this very, very, sweet Sister Anita, who at that time was a primary school teacher, didn't really know anybody, but because of her kindness and compassion, she was one of the most popular people in the school. I wrote to Sister Anita and asked her, can I use your photograph? She said, I'm honored that you're going to, and this really brings back memories for both of us. And I think that is what is so mutually enhancing. And why did I choose leaders, teachers as leaders? I've not thought through, and I was very reassured about what the Bhagavad Gita says. It says that leadership is about helping others to find their potential and purpose. And that is what the teachers do. And therefore, I think all of us must be inspired to be good teachers. whichever profession we're working in, so that we can actually generate a whole lot of leaders ahead of us. And that's really the purpose. So I hope in the Indian Psychiatric Society, one of the focus will be on generating new leaders who will have innovative ways of thinking and develop a purpose and direction for the Indian Psychiatric Society. And of course, that selfless giving is for the common good. And I don't think there's anything better in terms of a lesson for life. But let's go back a little bit much earlier into looking at the etymology of the term leader. And for once, the Greeks and the Latins didn't have a word for it. Normally, Greek and Latin is a word for everything. But this etymology of lead actually comes from Anglo-Saxon history, which means leaden or lithen, which means to travel. So leadership, depicts a journey that you go on. And therefore, way back in 825 ACE, it was basically to bring oneself or to bring another, a person or an animal, to a particular place. And that gradually changed over time to guiding a person both on action and opinion. And it was in the 1500s that the concept of headship or chief or principal assuming a primacy of position came up. And in 1828, in the Webster's Dictionary, the concepts of influence and exercising of dominions came up, and the term leadership was coined. In fact, there were various things like sunship, moonship, and of course leadership that came in there. And in more recent times, in the 1900s, the ability to lead is something that is associated with leadership. And in the 1900s and subsequently, the concept of leaderships in organizations has actually developed hugely. And in fact, a lot of the leadership that we talk about presently, many of the aspects of how do you develop a leader, how do you hone a leader, are taken actually from organizational psychology. And there's a lot of literature and research on that area presently. But as always, we can turn back to the Upanishads, which also define the qualities of a leader. And one of the qualities is self-discipline or self-regulation. It is the focus on real needs, not on just material needs, but on needs of growth and development. It is about character and integrity, and you will see that character and integrity are words that will keep coming up again and again in my presentation. It is also freedom from various vices. And what are these vices? So it is not just the positive attributes of a leader, but freedom from some of the negatives, which is heedlessness or pramada, alinga or aimlessness. So you should have some kind of aim or objective. Weakness, and that does not refer only to physical weakness, but also to being mentally weak. Crookedness or jingam. This is something that's also very important. Straightforwardness is very important. Falsehood is also a no-no, falsehood or antram, and deceitfulness or maya. These are the things that are not contrary to leadership, whereas the first few ones are what are the characteristics of a good leader. And therefore, what we have in the more modern world are a whole lot of things that about the Center for Creative Leadership talks about 12 qualities: self-awareness, respect for everybody else around you, compassion, which is something that we don't understand is a very important leadership quality, having a vision, a long-term vision as well as an immediate and a short-term vision, good communication. Again, Dr. Rathi referred to good listening as a communicator. Good listening skills, good responding skills are very important. The ability to constantly learn. So anybody who professes to be a leader must be a lifelong learner. That's also very important. Working with people, not just for people, but with people is very important. Being able to influence change in the position that you have is also very important for a leader. Integrity is also already something that the Bhagavad Gita also spoke about. And courage to speak out and make change is also an important characteristic. Gratitude is another important characteristic that we don't talk about much. And very often we forget that we need to be grateful to people on the path to leadership that continue to influence us as we grow further and further in what we are doing. And finally, resilience or the strength to be able to deal with the travails of leadership. It's important not to think that leadership is one wonderful, smooth journey with lots of good things. There are a lot of problems that come with having leadership positions, and learning how to deal with them is also very important. So what then shapes a leader? Can all of us be leaders? That's a question that needs to be thought about very carefully. Of course, personality very often defines a leader. People who are inquisitive by nature, who take a lot of initiative, who take interest in others, who are involved, generally drift towards leadership positions. Life experience can make leaders. So people who had been in situations where they were called on to exhibit courage, integrity, and so on, are likely to be in leadership positions. Character is something, again, I'm repeating about, very important to sustain. You may become a leader, but to sustain leadership, the demonstration of a sound character is very, very important. And of course, innovative ways of thinking is, again, something that shapes a leader. There are many theories about leaders. Plato said effective leaders are simply great men. No offense to the women. Unfortunately, Plato only thought about the men in his times. But the idea was that you have to be born a leader. However, other people have spoken about the fact that leadership can be a match of personality as well as a context. So there might be a person who can be a good leader in one particular context and a total misfit in leading in another context. And therefore, contexts are very important when determining leadership. Conventional theories talked about transactional forms of leadership, where it was like a quid pro quo between the leader and the follower. The leader gave something, the follower got something out of this relationship. Subsequently, the term leadership has kind of moved on to indicate more of a social, psychological perspective, where it represents the ability to create, represent, advance, or embed a shared sense of us. So that collective sense of bringing people together exemplifies current theories of leadership. So a leader is now identified as a person who enhances, who creates us, who brings us all together, who represents us and speaks up for us, and also advances us. So you see the movement in terms of understanding the position of leader from the leader themselves to the others around them. And that is a very important aspect of leadership in terms of identity enhancement. I'm sure many of you have read Stephen Covey's book on the habits of effective people. And I've suggested that these habits have to be developed a bit by bit, because you have to work on it. You have to strengthen the good things about yourself, work on your weaknesses, and align your values with the ethics. Showing empathy, again, a very important quality, courage, fortitude, honesty, and loyalty become very, very important in developing a habit of leadership. Now, I told you this was going to be a narrative. This is just a representational figure of the Department of Psychiatry at NIMHANS at one time. I'm not going to show all the faces here because I'm sure many of you will identify some of the faces. But what I wanted to say is this. Some are born leaders. Some achieve positions of leadership, and others have leadership thrust upon them. And therefore it's important, because you never know when leadership is required from you, that it is better to learn how to work in a leadership position. So here there are generations of people who have achieved very, very high levels of leadership. Dr. Gangadhar here, Dr. C.R. Chandrasekhar, who's so well known in public mental health, many other colleagues here who are excellent teachers. I'm not going to name each of them, who are role models for all of us, but mostly a new generation of young people sitting on the ground who were trainees once but are now consultants, leaders of units, and so on. So after this presentation, I can put up the slide again, and those of you who think you're on the slide, you may wish to come and identify yourselves. There are various styles of leadership. Dr. Rati mentioned the autocratic style. There's another one called the magnanimous autocrat. Very, very readily giving, but still very autocratic. There's the democratic leader. There is the laissez-faire leader. You go and do whatever you want. I'm in this position. I'm not going to interfere with you. All the responsibilities and duties are yours. The transformational leader, the transactional leader who does a quid pro quo kind of thing, the bureaucratic leader goes only by rules. Is it written in the rule book? Is it there in the Government of India rules? Is it there in our college rules? Is it there in the IPS rules? And the servant leader. So let me just talk about these for a bit. Transformational leadership appears to have most of the votes. And why is that? Because it raises the motivation and morality of groups. It derives a lot from various psychological, theories like Adler, from people like Adler, Maslow, Piaget, Erikson, etc. And also talks about the hierarchy of needs of people within an organization. And the general principles are of being motivating entire group, of trying to self-actualize. Self-actualization of the group, not of individuals, of getting the group to talk about a higher good, of active engagement as well as self-efficacy. The differences between transactional leadership and transformational leadership is that transformational focuses on long-term results, doesn't micromanage. It talks about a larger management system. It relies on communication, feedback, and empathy. It talks about creativity and personal growth of the group members, encourages innovation and strengthening of relationships. While transactional is strictly hierarchy-driven, this is more flexible. While transactional focuses on compliance to rules, etc., the transformation focuses on commitment to the ideology and work of the group. This talks about front and back. I've called it the two sides because traditionally leaders were front leaders. They were the ones who would go marching off into the battlefield, all your generals and so on. But now the idea is to lead from the back, to let others go in front of you and only be available to them should you need to be. It does not mean a passive role, it means an active role. And one of the concepts of this leading from the back is the concept of servant leadership, which is a style that emphasizing listening to and putting the needs of others first rather than the leader's own interest. So the leader shares the power, collaborates with people, and focuses on the potential of the team members. So listening, empathy, awareness, persuasion, healing when people are very distressed, helping them out, foresight and conceptualization are important characteristics of servant leadership. And as Nelson Mandela put it, the transformational leader stays behind the flock. He lets the most nimble of them go ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that they're all being directed from behind. So this is a leader who, Lao Tse Sung said, is never seen. Everybody believes that they've done the work themselves, but there is a hand which is guiding this. Of course, all of these styles have their own advantages and disadvantages, but it's very important to understand that there is no single theory of leadership, and mostly it is about taking people forward. Persuasive leadership is another style which helps greatly to build relationships, to resolve conflicts, to strengthen empathy, and to help people understand that you are an authentic leader. Authenticity is very, very important in a leadership position. I also wanted to say leaders are seen as tall men, usually, good physique, well-dressed. There are leaders who come in all shapes and all forms. Very important to remember. And of course, there are two kinds of skills that people may develop in positions, particularly in academic leadership, which is a breadth of experience, knowledge, and skills, but a depth of high level of expertise in one discipline. And many academicians nowadays tend to be like that. These are called the T-shaped skills, but there is also the X-shaped skill, which in addition talks about leadership or executive skills and subject matter expertise as well. But in the latter part of my presentation, I want to say there is the daily leader, and we need to focus on the daily leader. No one arrives as a leader. It is important to understand how a common person like you, me, everybody else can be in leadership action. So it is not who they are, but what they do that determines the leadership position. And it's not just the position of leadership, but the qualities of the leadership that are very important. There is also a dark side to leadership. There is what is called the dark triad of leadership, and we all know from global experience and worldview what these can be. High degree of narcissism, being in love with oneself all the time. A high degree of hubris, believing that I know all, everything about everything, and nobody else knows, nobody else's views are important. And of course, Machiavellism, which is about cunning and deceit and getting your way around through improper methods. Poor communication can also be a dark side of leadership. Opacity or lack of transparency in functioning, a failure to accept responsibility. Dr. Verma used to say the buck stops with me. So whatever happens in the organization or in your team, you have to take the blame for it, not just the accolades. And not listening to anyone, which is again the hubris, and providing an intimidating work environment where people fear. I remember a teacher who would go to a patient and ask him whether he's taken his medicine. If he hasn't taken the medicine, the doctor would give him a tight slap and get a promise from that individual that he would take him. Is he likely to respond after that humiliation? Unlikely. So intimidation by itself as a sole kind of strategy doesn't always work. There are lots of challenges to leadership. It's not easy to be in a leadership position. Time management, very often multiple tasks, all of which need attention at the same time. Managing difficult people can also be a very, very difficult thing. Managing the pressures that various people put on you. I can tell you for an hour what kind of pressures I get. Diffusing conflict, particularly among your team members. Crisis management. The other four are equally important. When something goes wrong, you tend to lose confidence and question yourself on whether you really have the ability to be a leader. And I'm sure all of us have experienced this at some time. Fear of failing and actually failing. These can also be huge challenges for a leader. And staying motivated even in the face of adversity is also a very important challenge. How do you then become resilient as a leader? So having a growth mindset, taking care of yourself, easier said than done, but you have to find time to do something that calms you down. Build a support system. I cannot tell you how important it is to have a good support system of peers, of subordinates, of colleagues, of family members who can all support you, and friends who can support you in times of crisis. Adaptability and flexibility are also very important to cultivate. Having realistic goals, learning from failures and not buckling under failure, and staying focused on performance are all likely to help a leader get through difficult times. And of course, be a smart leader. It's important to know what's urgent and what's not urgent, what's important and what's not important. So do the things that are urgent and important, plan for the things that are important but not urgent. It's urgent but not important. Try and delegate it to somebody else and eliminate what's not urgent and not important. Learning to do that strategically. All of us need to learn to do this all the time. The Bhagavad Gita talks about certain important aspects of resilience. One is sankalpa, which is to set a goal, very important. Diksha, to give yourself to that particular action. Abhyasa, which is doing something on a regular basis. Shraddha, which is to have faith and conviction in what you do. The courage or confidence to carry out it, which is called virya. Smriti, or remembering from the past, learning from others and not repeating the same mistakes. Prajna, the intelligence to make the right kind of decisions. Samadhi, which is concentration and complete absorption in any task that you might do. Vairagya, which is karmanyavadikaraste mapaleshu gadachana. Whether there's success or failure, take it in your stride. Tapa, which is austerity. And samatvam, which is equanimity in the face of both success as well as failure. These are very, very good guiding principles for success and for leadership. In the last couple of minutes of my presentation, I'll talk about leadership in medicine and psychiatry. Unfortunately, as Mathis says, there is nothing in a physician's education and training that qualifies them to be a leader. So it's important to get a balcony view to really not only look at individual patients, but look at the system and try and evolve a more connected leadership. And that requires both management skills and leadership skills, both of which are not the same. Management is about coping with day-to-day problems, coping with complex organizational problems, and ensuring smooth functioning. Leadership is about visioning, aligning people, setting directions, as well as coping with change. So it's important to be able to have people who do both these. And of course, the need to train in leadership. So we need to move from just clinical and teaching and research and administrative context of medicine need to be learned. Action learning principles need to be taught, including self-reflection, theory, practice, and skills. We need to inspire leaders to give them opportunities to engage, support, and celebrate success, and address the training needs of physicians for the diverse roles that they are likely to occupy. So many undergraduate students, once they finish, are likely to go and have to run a department. So have we taught them the skills to do that? These are things we need to think about. So the health leadership model talks about an inspired shared purpose, connecting, having a vision, engaging the team, developing capability, and influencing for results. And as mentioned in the BMJ, we need to create leaders, and leadership is about inspiring the best and role modeling for the generations to come to be the best version of themselves. This is Awan Berkeley Hill's grave, and Vinod Sinha took us here. And what it says so beautifully is that the care of the human mind is the noblest form of medicine. So, my friends, you are in the noblest form of medicine. So we need to take it very, very seriously. And there are challenges in psychiatry in addition to the challenges of medicine, which is the complex nature of the discipline, the high degree of empathy that is required to understand all the complexities, the perspectives, and the experiences. We probably need to be more adaptable than any other professional. Effective communication is a critical part of our therapeutic alliance. We work with a multidisciplinary team, so having collaborative approaches, innovative ways of thinking, and ethical decision making becomes very important. I've had experiences of leadership positions, starting with residency, to a young faculty, to working with the National Human Rights Commission, building up the addiction network, being involved in psychotherapy supervision, in training in psychiatry, heading a department and heading an institution. And all of these have been very, very relevant in all these aspects of my leadership. I'm going to end by talking about a leadership program that just concluded yesterday, which is the training of young psychiatrists, the 10th year that is being held, which is conducted by Dr. Norman Sartorius. He is going to speak next, and you cannot listen to a better leader than Dr. Norman Sartorius. I'm not going to talk about his personal accomplishments, but I want to say is that there are so many leadership learnings from Dr. Sartorius about how to make a presentation, chair a meeting, talk to media, maintain work-life balance, make a poster, select a title, and other things. And finally, how to be a better person. I'm just going back to the previous slide to say that along with Dr. Norman Sartorius, you see Dr. Mohan Isaac, who himself is a great example of all these leadership qualities, Dr. Santosh Chaturvedi, Dr. Prabha Chandra, several other alumni of the program who have themselves become leaders, and a new set of leaders who we look forward to lead us in the next generation. And of course, my experience started way back in 1994. So you can imagine that 3 decades of listening to it has certainly helped me somewhere, I believe, in my own profession. So, in terms of effective leadership, the concept of leadership has evolved. The core values remain the same. While positions are important, qualities are critical. We need to focus on training in leadership in our profession. We need to teach people how to become resilient leaders, and we have a responsibility to train the next generation to be better leaders than ourselves. I want to invite all of you who are alumni of NIMANS to visit the beautiful campus and join us in celebrating 70 years of the All India Institute of Mental Health. I conclude on that note and thank you once again for your patient hearing.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Pratima Murthy, for an excellent elaboration on the leadership. Particularly, you started with the leaders who inspired you during your childhood and continued with the definition of the leadership, quality of the leadership, personality of the leadership. There were a lot of information and education in that. and you reiterated the importance of the leadership in the field of medicine and the field of psychiatry. I do agree that we require leadership not only in the psychiatric education and medical education, but also in removing stigma, spreading awareness, having activism in the psychiatry. And for that, the speech which you have given today will be very, very helpful. Thank you today, madam. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, wonderful and wonderful speech on leadership. Today we had 2 sessions, but you were included all the aspects of leadership. Basically, leadership is not about creating followers, but leadership is basically about creating new leaders. That is, and that everything which you have mentioned is very good in its perspective lens. I hope all of us are enlightened on the topic very well, and we thank you very much. A big round of applause again for Dr. Pratima Murthy, please. With this, I hand over this to organizers, please. As we are not only running on time, we are saving some time also.
Sir, audience question.
Audience questions are not allowed in these orations. That is not this. So questions are not allowed. Neither in the presidential address, so no, not in this oration also.
Thank you, dear madam, for taking us through that insightful professional journey and for inspiring us to better ourselves through this oration like the excellent leader you always are. I request Dr. Lakshmikant Reddy, Honorable President of Indian Psychiatric Society, to hand over a memento to Pratima Murthy Madam as a token of our love, respect and appreciation. Now, we are moving on to the